Hello, everyone. So let me just quickly introduce myself. So I'm Bea. I work at a company called Reckitt. It's the company behind all these amazing brands. As you can see, these brands exist to protect, heal, and nurture as we pursue a cleaner and healthier world. So I joined the company in September 2019 to lead global insights for the germ protection brand Lysol. And as you can imagine, it has been like an incredible journey. I joined September 2019, just 3 months later. COVID hit, and that was an immense transformation like in the business. And it was very interesting from an insights perspective, especially just navigating the evolved consumer and market landscape for a disinfection brand. And since the middle of this year, I started to lead and build the European insights team. Working on our hygiene portfolio working across all these amazing brands and across these different markets. And working on the hygiene household portfolio, it's been just an incredible journey, as I mentioned, understanding how consumers have evolved, what are the changes in the consumer preference, habits, and behaviors, and that's exactly what I'm gonna talk about today. So, just a bit of a background. I wanted to talk a little bit about the brands. Who here has heard of the brand Lysol? Who heard about the brand Sagrotan? Napisan? Glen 20? Any Aussies out there? Maybe not. But what do these brands stand for? Disinfection, germ protection, and I think that's basically where our equity lies. And the mission or the focus of these brands is to really protect and keep people illness-free by breaking the chain of infection. And this has always been the mission of these brands, to really drive these hygiene habits to be able to protect our consumers and keep everyone illness-free. So we have different purpose programs across many different markets to do exactly this. So what we'll cover today, just a little bit of a background, the huge inflection point that we've all been through today, this last year, the big question, what actually is gonna stick? There's been a huge shift in terms of behaviors. What's gonna stay? What's not gonna stay? And I'm going to talk about what we did as a company to be able to address that. And so now, what do we do? So needless to say, COVID is a huge inflection point for our business, especially for a disinfection or a hygiene brand. It has, as I mentioned earlier, we have all these purpose programs, or we try to drive hygiene habits amongst our consumers to keep them protected and to stop the spread of illnesses, for example, the flu and all. And we've seen that progress throughout the years. Slowly, more and more people are wiping down their surfaces, more and more people are washing their hands more. However, we haven't seen such an accelerator. You know, this little thing called COVID, in case you haven't heard about it. So as I said, March 2020 was a huge inflection point for the business. We saw two key shifts. First is increase in germ concern. People were scared. People were scared about getting coronavirus. 75% were scared that they will contract the virus. 87% of people worried for their safety. More and more people were more concerned about germs. 85% more people improved their hygiene habits. So that was one key shift. The other one was we all stayed at home. Since that all the COVID news hit, everyone became more concerned about hygiene and everyone started staying at home. So many more people, or a lot of people, every single one of us, I think, in this room, have our routines impacted. A lot of people were working from home, staying at home. So that's another key shift. And these two key shifts have a lot of impact or changes and drove a lot of changes also in a lot of behaviors. So that increase in hygiene habits, so many more people were washing their hands more often, using hand sanitizers more often, disinfecting surfaces and high-touch surfaces, wearing masks. And then the other key shift around staying at home, so people started working from home. People started all the restaurants are closed, so people started cooking more at home, no more traveling. And this is incredible as well, the e-com penetration. It has taken so long, so over a decade, to reach to 16%. And within a couple of weeks, grew so significantly. So as we all know, COVID has driven a huge shift in people's behaviors, and the everyday things that we used to do seem just worlds away. Who can still imagine like sharing food with friends? Today we have like the buffet here. Before it seemed so normal to just sit there, have a little chat next to the buffet table. But now like, oh, can't do that. We're all wearing masks. Sharing a drink with some friends. I don't know if people still do that. Blowing a birthday cake like with some colleagues. Is that something we really want to do? And today I was standing by the lift. And I was like, do I really want to go in there? It's like, oh, there's already 2 people there. That's way too much for me. So it's really, I think we have all these things that just seem so normal, hugging a bunch of randoms. So all these things that just seem so normal for us suddenly seem so worlds away. But we've seen like a little bit of an evolution. Like now we have a buffet, but it's with masks. Now, before there was just like 1 person in the lift. Now, okay, 2 is okay as long as you keep a little bit of the distance. So it is evolving. But there are still things that might stick. And the question is, as the context changes, as things progress, the big question that we got asked is what's gonna stick? At the time, our business unit was called, in Reckitt, so we were in charge of like the household portfolio. It was called Hygiene Home. So as you can imagine, these 2 key shifts had a huge impact to our business. And the question was, what are consumers gonna continue to do? And what are consumers gonna stop doing? So this question, what's gonna stick? I kid you not, I got asked this question every single day, or our team got asked this question every single day, at least 10 times a day. Everyone wanted to know. So everyone wanted to, like the marketing teams, the trade teams, finance teams, the marketing director, an ABM, my bosses, the CEO wants to know, like our customers want to know, what's gonna stick? I mean, and I also want to know, of course, but but that's basically, unfortunately, there's no crystal ball here. I'm not like a fortune teller. People always ask like, oh, you know what's gonna happen? Are people gonna continue disinfecting? Are people gonna continue? Because also the more they stay at home, they like wash their dishes more, they clean the home more. So are people gonna continue doing this? So there's no crystal ball. And I can't predict everything, but I'm a curious person, and the whole team were like also very curious, and we want to attempt to answer this. So what did we do? We can't fully predict everything, but we can look at what people think, what people know, first of all, what people think, how people feel, and hopefully with that could give us an indication or give us a gauge on what people might do. And it's important to understand how this information and how the sentiments evolve over time as well. So what did we do? First, understand the context. There's lots of open source data out there. Like I looked at the World in Data website so much, looking at like the number of COVID cases because that's impacting how concerned people are. I was such a dork. Like at dinner table, I would sit there and I would say like, oh, do you know how many COVID cases today was in the US versus in Germany versus in Brazil? And also, it was the same when the vaccinations first started rolling out. I'm like, did you know, like in Israel, they increased the vaccinations just by this amount of time? So everyone was really, really laughing at me and like, oh, what is this? Like, of course, they're also curious about the topic. But yeah, so that was like a #1 source of like information for me. And there's a lot of government websites as well to give us this information. So there's lots of open sources, just understanding what the context is and what could dictate how people might start thinking. So that's the background. But we need to understand what's the consumer sentiment and what are the behaviors consumers have. So very quickly, as soon as the lockdowns started, were announced, we set up a monthly COVID tracker, or we set up a tracker just to get a read of, I think in a matter of days, we set this up across multiple markets. It was really speed over perspection. We just needed to get a sense of how people were feeling. The questions that we asked were around how concerned were they about the coronavirus? What are the changes in their hygiene behaviors? Are they cleaning their homes more often? Are they washing their dishes more often? So think the behaviors that are related to our categories. And it gave us a sense of like a pulse on how people are feeling. And we started with one wave, but then we thought like, oh, it's really interesting to track this. And as COVID also evolved, we just like, okay, let's just run it like, for a couple of months. Let's see how it goes. Okay, now it's been like a year and a half and we're still here, but the data is super valuable. So I wouldn't know what I would have done or what we would have done without this. And the whole organization uses it as well. But we can't just look at the numbers. We need to also look at or understand how people were feeling, and we're gonna come to the whys. So in addition to a regular pulse on like how people are feeling, we also wanted to have that qualitative feedback. So we launched, also in March, like when the lockdowns hit, consumer videos to understand or to complement some of the data that we were seeing, to get some of the whys behind these behavior changes. I mean, we had a hypothesis, but of course, it's very good to hear from consumers. And that was also done on a regular cadence. So we did that when COVID first hit, like when the lockdown started, when people were already months and months at home and not having any changes, kind of like, oh, I'm getting a little bit used to being at home, but getting a little bit like, oh, when is this gonna end? When things started opening up over the last summer, because cases were down, like in Europe and the US. And then when it became really bad again, like over the winter, when there were so many cases, and then when the vaccines first started rolling out. So every key moment we had in addition to the data, which we got like on a monthly basis, also the consumer sentiments around it. So, so those were the things that we did. And also, this is like throughout the organization. As I said, everyone wants to know. So we needed to kind of like establish, or we followed a couple of key principles on how we wanted to engage. First of all, continuous and constant pulse check, given the volatile environment. So things change. Now, most people are vaccinated, but we don't know how it's gonna happen. So we needed just that constant pulse. Going into the why. Florent said earlier in the panel, it's really important to go into the drivers. Why, and ask again, why are people feeling this way? This is also very interesting, learning from countries ahead of the curve. At a certain period, we were all so deep into like the coronavirus cases in Europe or in the US, but there were markets that were not, like had COVID under a bit control, like Australia, for example. They were open, like over the winter here, it was summer there, things were open. They were going to bars, they were going to restaurants, but they went through COVID as well. They went through the lockdowns. Are they still continuing their hygiene habits? Are they still washing their hands? Are they still checking in? Are they still wearing masks? And we had a view of, could this give us an indication on how people might behave once most of the countries have COVID under control? The other country that we looked at was Israel, for example. When vaccinations first started rolling out, this was the country who had most of their population fully vaccinated, or like started vaccinations much faster. So we were learning like, oh, how are people there behaving? How people feel there? So it was really interesting for us to use that also to be able to predict or gauge what people might do in most of the other countries. Democratizing data, I think that's also, as I said, everyone wanted to know what's going on. But also, we're not the only people thinking in the company. I think there's a lot of insights, and every single market would also have their insights for their market. So these dashboards, or all the data that we have, all the consumer videos, was basically accessible to everyone. And they could pull the data specifically for any questions that they might have from their management teams, from their customers. But of course, people could also interpret a lot of different things there. So we still had a regular engagement. So we really drove that external focus and consumer centricity amongst our key stakeholders in the full organization by every so often, like maybe I think every 2 months or every quarter, we'd have a consolidated like insight understanding done across multiple markets to be able to tie back things together, not let people run off like interpreting different things, and also gathering and collaborating with the different markets to be able to create a global and consolidated view coming from the insights community. So throughout this period, we saw ups and downs in sentiments across the different markets because we saw COVID cases going up and down across the different markets. In India, there was a huge wave. In the US, it's like this. So people, and then we looked at it very granular on a market level. And then we also tracked like vaccination progress. And we saw also the ups and downs in terms of concern across these different markets, which is impacting people's behavior related to these two shifts. So increase in germ concern and better hygiene habits. Even up until now, people are still doing it significantly more than they used to do. Social distancing and staying at home. Yeah, I mean, now things are open, people are going out more, but in general, people are still, I mean, I still work from home most of the time. I go into the office maybe like once or twice a week. And then there are behaviors that's also sticking, like shopping online, they're doing that much more often. Shopping in-store, that's, oh, you don't see the access there, but that's kind of like dropped, like they're doing that much less versus they used to do. So as I mentioned, at the time, we studied markets that are more advanced in the vaccination progress to be able to predict what behaviors would stick. So we looked at Israel at the time, that was in March, I think, where they had 60% vaccination. And we saw a difference in terms of how people would behave. There were behaviors that was gonna stick more, and there were behaviors that was gonna drop once they get vaccinated. And we're like, now going back to like, why? So why this gap? We dove deeper into the consumer sentiments and whys. People in general felt that hygiene habits are good for you anyway. It's not just COVID related, it's for the flu. It's just better for your health. So we wanted to, we tried to understand what would make them continue washing hands versus wearing a mask. People are just like working in bars the whole 10 hours, wearing a mask is a little bit tough if you're in a closed environment and continuously like trying to serve people. So some behaviors are just not very easy to do. Social distancing, for example, people really miss their families, miss their parents, they really wanted to hug them again. So there are things that they say like, oh, if my parents are also, then I'm vaccinated, my parents are vaccinated, the risk is not that much. If I wash my hands, it's not that difficult. If I sanitize my hands, there's like hand sanitizers everywhere anyway, so it's not that difficult for consumers. So we try to understand like the why behind the numbers that we were seeing. And we also looked into some behavior change theories, examined some of the behaviors. So like washing hands, hand sanitizing, wearing masks, staying at home. There were things that people could, all of these things people could do, but some things they're not necessarily motivated to do, and some things they're not necessarily encouraged to do. So I think it was really interesting for us to understand like those different dynamics and the underlying motivations for people. We also needed to understand what is the sustained impact of this significant behavior change. And we looked at different factors we needed to understand. And we did this on a market level, looking at like how intense the pandemic was in a particular market, underlying level of concern. So for example, like in the US, people are more concerned about viruses and like more concerned about germs versus in, let's say like in Germany, where people are like, some germs are good for you, I think. Like, I think this is what, and then also looking at the penetration headroom. So some categories, it also differs per category. So some categories have very low penetration that it could like just go increase anyway, versus others that are already very high penetration that could kind of like go back a little bit. And that would give us like an idea on what the structural retention is. And of course, we can't just rely on what is, or we just don't like react to things. We also want to be able to drive things ourselves. So we identified ways to be able to sustain and create these behaviors that we know are good for consumers. So for example, our amazing Italian team, our amazing Italian Napison team was able to drove kind of like understanding the consumer behaviors and worked with different agencies and different partners to be able to develop nudges to drive these behaviors. So there are things to be able to educate and enable consumers to continue with these hygiene habits that are good for them. So yes, so now, what did we learn? So we wanted to go deeper into the whys to really understand. So I think it's really important for us to go deeper into the whys to understand the underlying motivations for people. As I mentioned, sometimes the data isn't so easy to interpret. So we wanted to kind of okay, what does that mean for us? And what might be driving this certain behavior? Is there an underlying motivation there? Be open and continuously learn. As I said, it's not stagnant. It's an evolving thing. And we see a shift throughout the period. And we want to continuously learn and update our understanding. That's why I also invite the different markets, different agencies to sort of collaborate. And now, as I said, we have this behavioral tracker which has 60,000 responses, and we have a lot of these consumer videos. We use them, but I think there's still a lot we can do with this data. So if there's any brilliant ideas out there as well, what do you think we could do with that? I'd love to also have a chat and see what we can further do. I think last but not the least, we want to not take necessarily a reactive role to things, because as industry leaders, we also need to be more proactive and be the one to actually drive and sustain some of these hygiene habits. That's already the focus of the company. We want to continue driving kind of protection for our consumers. So we want to be able to sustain and create these behaviors to drive as part of our purpose journey. So that was our journey in Reckitt. So just wanted to share, and thank you. And any questions?
Yeah, thank you very much. I can imagine there's a few questions.
Hello. Does it work? It does. Thank you for your presentation. I think that was a very smart way to kind of keep the pulse of what's going on with those changing consumer behaviors in COVID times. I would say short to midterm. My question is if you would be willing to share your predictions for longer term. Which of those consumer behavior changes that we observed in the past 2 years you feel are going to stick when the pandemic is over, let's say a year after the WHO announces the end of the pandemic, and which of those do you feel will be most significant for businesses?
So I think, so I got to give all the information, right? Because that's also something that we are still in the process of understanding. Also, there are analysis that we cannot necessarily share externally. But I do think what I said earlier is really understanding what are kind of the underlying motivations, and maybe looking at this framework, seeing what are the behaviors that people can easily just do, which behaviors they have known not necessarily big barriers for, and understanding, what are the opportunities for them to actually be able to sustain those. Sorry, I can't give a very direct answer, but hopefully that gives a little bit of a framework on how we might be thinking about it.
Thanks, Bear. That's great. You said you've got a lot of behavioral data left that you're still trying to work out what that is. What sort of form is that in? And
Well, it's a lot of survey data. So there's a lot of just consumer response, oh, I'm doing this more, I'm doing this less. It's also brand choice behaviors. So yeah, it's basically based on survey data. And then we also have a lot of the consumer videos where we ask them to do certain things, and also, which we have watched. We haven't done any kind of analysis on it in terms of love to see oh, are there AI? So that's why I was interested in some of the talks today, to see, oh, can we actually have a better way to answer this without necessarily having to sit through all these videos.
Yeah, totally. Thanks.
Okay, So, yeah, just as a follow-up question for the first question, I assume your CEO would ask you now, like, can you predict some scenarios what the impact of sales will be within the next 6 to 12 months? So, were you able to get to
Yeah.
that?
So I mean that was really the question, right? Like every day that was the question that we were getting. And Irina's here also laughing because she also gets this question. But yes, so we, as I said, no crystal ball, but we use certain frameworks. We use a lot of this data to be able to predict it. And rightly, as you said, like it's really like scenario based. You need to think like, okay, if this happens, could this happen? If this happens, does this happen? So I think we looked at several different ones, and yeah, for now, like that's what we are relying on, we're using, but we're constantly, and I think that's a challenge for us and also us, all of us as insights professionals, right? That how can we lead the thinking? How can we really drive thought leadership in this that we cannot fully predict? And that's something that we need to be transparent on as well. That, yeah, this isn't, also this whole year was just unpredictable. So we can make like these gauge, or like we can gauge it based on this data, but things could change.
How has it changed the internal impression of the insights and analytics function, and also has that flowed through to any change in budget?
No, I mean, I think in the company, like, people are very consumer centric. So there's always a lot of value attached to the insights function. So I wouldn't say that it's necessarily like changed the impression for the team, because I think people already constantly ask like, we don't feel underutilized as an insight function. We actually feel like, oh, we're really contributing and we're making significant contributions. So it was really just part of what we say is our job, I think. Of course, it was much appreciated. There are more questions coming, but that's just how it is, I think.
And have you seen any change in budget?
I mean, I think during that period, people knew that we needed to like invest more and like understand. So, for example, like launching like this 20-country tracker, we're like, we just have to do it. Like it's not like we can't not do it. This is not even a discussion. So I think people know the questions and people will put like the right budget. And I think that's a really amazing investment for us, because I think now I use it all the time, like this tracker, for example. But yeah, it doesn't necessarily like, oh, no, I don't think we can attach like, oh, now we have like insights function, we prove like our value, we can get more budget. Not necessarily. But it's just like, we have a business question, we put the money behind it to be able to understand if we can't answer it with the resources that we have now.
It's fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing. That's really incredible.
Thanks. Thanks all.